Estimados, damas y caballeros, en los exilios venezolano y cubano, tenemos en nuestro país una red de noticias que se llama The Real News Network, TRNN. The Real News no está satisfecha con apoyar en una revolución comunista en mi patria, los Estados Unidos. Ella también está justificando los crímenes en contra de sus paisanos en Venezuela. Presta atención en la historia de hoy en que ellos se culpan a los opositores del régimen chavista.
It's the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Perez coming to you from Baltimore. Violence flared up again in Venezuela on Wednesday and Thursday when at least 7 people were killed in 48 hours. The opposition has been calling for a new wave of protests and street blockades throughout the country, enticing and escalating the violence that the government is responding to. These renewed protests are also taking place just days after President Maduro said that he had foiled a coup attempt on the day that a police officer stole a police helicopter and dropped grenades and fired shots at the building of a Supreme Court. While this is going on, the National Electoral Council is engaged in preparations for a National Constituent Assembly.
En allí clip de video, la periodista de TRNN está llamando a los manifestantes como agresores y al gobierno Maduro como los defensores. No obstante de que en los últimos 3 años muchas figuras de la oposición demócrata como Leopoldo Lopez fueron encarcelados y torturados por las fuerzas de seguridad. ¿Qué es la actitud de TRNN en otros ejemplos de la tal violencia? Véanse a este clip acerca de las manifestaciones contra la policía en Portland, Oregon, alrededor de las manifestaciones contra el Islam radical.
It's The Real News. I'm Aaron Mate. Anti-Muslim protests were held across the U.S. on Saturday, but the so-called National March Against Sharia was vastly outnumbered by counter-demonstrators in more than a dozen cities. Several arrests were made, including in Seattle, where clashes between the two sides broke out. The March Against Sharia was organized by Act for America. The Southern Poverty Law Center calls Act for America a hate group, but it has close ties to top Republicans, including some in the White House. And that's helped fuel concern over the blurring of lines between right-wing extremists and government. Joining me is a journalist who covers the far right extensively, Arun Gupta. He reported on the Seattle protests for Ross Story, and he also wrote a recent expose for The Intercept on the ties between militia members and police at a similar protest in Portland last week. Arun, welcome.
Great to be with you, Aaron.
Thanks for joining us.
Prestan atención de que el presentador de las noticias no da ninguna explicación de qué hicieron los manifestantes antiderechistas.
You were at the Seattle protest, which was the most fiery of all the demonstrations that took place across the country this weekend in the so-called March Against Sharia. Talk about what you saw.
So it was a relatively small gathering, a few score. The easiest way to describe it is it felt like some sort of science fiction or fantasy gaming conventions. It was overwhelmingly guys, mostly white, and they were clustered in little groups based on like similar.
Prestan atención de que el periodista del izquierdo se llaman a los manifestantes como blancos, no obstante de que Act for America está liderado desde Brigitte Gabriel, una mujer libanesa.
hairstyles, clothing, insignias. So you had like Proud Boys, which is this Western chauvinist group that was founded by a former founder of Vice magazine. There were these fasci guys, that's a reference to the haircut they have, who have fascist haircuts. There were 3% militia members. There were guys waving the Kekistan flag, which is this flag of the mythical nation of Kekistan.
La bandera de Kekistan es una broma desde trolls de internet y no es de una organización neonazista.
Something invented by 4chan trolls. And if it all sounds really opaque and weird, that's kind of the point. It's something where it's very much a subculture where they're signaling to each other. Like, one thing to understand is, like, a lot of these like tiny subcultures don't really like each other that much. But what unites them is kind of this hatred of Muslims, this hatred of the anti-fascists known as Antifa, and then also kind of this deep-seated current of misogyny that runs through their politics.
Which is ironic because the premise of marching against Sharia, according to the organizers, is to defend women's rights, right?
Yeah, well, that's the thing. They're obsessed with women, right? Everything about Sharia is women, and that's one of the things that I found curious because, first of all, Sharia law doesn't really make that much sense. There's an Islamic law. Sharia actually...
Ni el presentador ni siquiera el otro periodista hablaron de la violencia de Antifa o acción antifascista en contra de una manifestación anti-Sharia. Porque en el ejemplo norteamericano, The Real News no condena a los manifestantes violentos de Antifa, que ya han hecho muchos daños de negocios y asaltaron y hirieron a sus propios opositores civiles. Así vemos la agenda de The Real News. Cuando en Venezuela una población hambrienta, empobrecida y desesperada está luchando para el derecho de vivir en libertad, son criminales y secuaces del imperialismo yanqui. Sin embargo, cuando estudiantes ricos y comunistas norteamericanos están detenidos porque atentaron a asaltar otros manifestantes, son culpables la policía y milicianos. Y ahí, mis oyentes, es la justicia social de la izquierda. Ustedes pueden dar sus opiniones de la cobertura de The Real News en Facebook, @TheRealNews, y Twitter, @TheRealNews.